Is globalization an attack on democracy? Part 2 of 2. In the first video, we discussed how the multinational corporate and Wall Street agenda has helped keep wages down through globalization, while increasing business profit at the expense of the average citizen, reflecting a corporate and anti-labor policy agenda and thus diminishing the powers of democracy. We also quickly covered a particular Wall Street group called Goldman Sachs, who seem to have their fingers in every pie out there. Since my first video, Goldman Sachs is now under investigation for fraud by the Securities and Exchange Commission, only in civil courts. Keep an eye on this story. Not satisfied with their level of political control, the business community has pushed for international agreements and policy actions by the IMF, World Bank, and G20 that further encroach on the ability of independent democratic countries to act on behalf of their people. These agreements and the demands of the international financial institutions invariably call for the policies desired by the corporate community. In the early 1980s, the IMF and World Bank took advantage of the Third World debt crisis, forcing the acceptance of, quote, structural adjustment programs, end quote. These forced the borrowing countries to agree to give first priority to external debt repayment, private as well as government. It compelled them to adapt austerity programs, which we now see in Greece and Iceland, of tight money, budget cutbacks, forcing heavily on social expenditures affecting the poor and ordinary citizens. It forced privatization, allegedly in the interests of efficiency.
Every nation gets the same exact four-step program to the free market paradise. Step 1, freedom for hot money. Step 2, freedom to increase prices. Step 3, free trade for all. And step 4, where it all begins, is the freedom to privatize everything.
In Tanzania, the bank's idea of a poverty reduction strategy was to require the government to raise the price of medicine during an AIDS epidemic. In Bolivia, the bank's poverty reduction strategy was to demand increases in the price of water. That strategy produced riots. And in Ecuador, the poverty reduction strategy included increasing the price of cooking gas by 60%. And the nation exploded.
The riots in Ecuador came as no surprise to the World Bank. We've obtained some confidential documents from inside. This one's the master strategy for Ecuador. It says the bank knew that their plans pushed down real wages and shoved 51% of the population below the poverty line. They even scripted in riots. They said their plans would lead to social unrest. The Insider heard the same story about Indonesia.
They had been warned if the policies of austerity were continued, economy would go down. The probability of social and political turmoil was very high. They've been warned. And the unfortunate thing is those predictions came out to be true. Finally, the whole cauldron blew up and did enormous damage from which the country has still not recovered.
What got Indonesia was step 3 of the IMF assistance program, ending all controls on capital. This left Indonesia's fate to the mood of speculators and what Stiglitz calls hot money. In Asia, it was the nations that refused the IMF medicine that escaped the financial flames.
Both of them weathered the global financial crisis very well. India's been having growth rate over the past decade of in excess of 5%. China's growth rate has been even faster. Neither of them follow the dictum of having capital market liberalization.
Step 4, free trade. According to the Insider, the World Trade Organization just makes the rich richer.
So much so that after the last round of trade negotiations, the Uruguay round in 1994, calculations of the World Bank showed that sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region of the world, was actually worse off by more than 2%. While the United States was bragging about how many billions and billions of dollars better off it was.
Stiglitz says the WTO operates like the British Empire in the Opium Wars, when Britain forced China at gunpoint to open its markets to British narcotics. The new drug wars are over the WTO's intellectual property treaty. Until this month, British and American drug companies used WTO rules to prevent AIDS victims in South Africa from getting cheap medicine.
South Africa said, we want to be able to produce that drug ourselves and sell it at costs that the people can afford. And the drug company said, if you do that, you're violating intellectual property rights. We don't care if people die. Intellectual property rights are really supreme. And people heard about this, and they are outraged. And the protesters put such pressure that today now the drug companies have backed down.
One lost skirmish for the drug companies, but the deadly WTO rule still survives. And back at the IMF and World Bank spring meeting today, World Bank chief Jim Wolfenson is still musing about world domination.
We've done a lot of things well. We've made a lot of mistakes, but no more or no less than I think any other highly intelligent, well-meaning group of people in the most difficult area. And in some cases, I really wish I was president of a world government, because then I could make sure everything worked, knowing, as you all do, of my great skill as an administrator.
A characteristic of the IMF World Bank actions is that they rest on a false reading of recent experience and economic history. The claim that free trade is the route to economic growth and prosperity can be confuted by historical experience. No country, past or present, has taken off into sustained economic growth and moved from economic backwardness to prosperity without large-scale government protection and subsidization of infant industries and other modes of insulation from powerful outsiders. This includes Great Britain, the United States, Japan, Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, and even Canada, all highly protectionist and early takeoff phases of their growth process. The governments and institutions bargaining on behalf of multinational corporations set restrictions on countries to prevent government protection of industries from outside sources. This reduces the effectiveness of unions and regional interests, again showing how democracy is diminished. In Canada, we have the National Policy of 1879. The economic policy was partly intended to encourage the creation of an industrial base in Canada by protecting so-called infant industries against the competition of larger and more established firms abroad. This was eventually eroded away. In most cases, subsidization or protection was no longer needed. Today, the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and NAFTA have been able to remove these modes of protection from less developed countries. This threatens them with extensive takeovers from abroad, thereby integrating them into the global economic system. In summary, we are in the midst of an anti-democratic counter-revolution, in which globalization is being used to weaken popular and elected authority in favor of a system dominated by super-citizens, the multinational corporations. This process sows the seeds of its own destruction, as it serves a small global minority, damages the majority, breeds financial instability, and exacerbates the environmental crisis. Its destructive tendencies are likely to produce an explosion if the process is not contained and democracy is not rehabilitated. Halting this anti-democratic juggernaut will be difficult, not only because of the power of its beneficiaries, but also because it operates within the framework of democratic structures and musters plausible arguments. But these arguments are self-serving and wrong, and should be vigorously contested. An agenda should be advanced that serves ordinary citizens rather than the multinational corporations and financial institutions. This agenda should include strenuous opposition to all international agreements that take power out of the hands of democratic governments to serve some alleged economic needs of the few. In order for there to be a people's agenda, people are going to require a combination of understanding, education, and effective organization. I believe that when we look back on history, people will talk of this time as either the second age of enlightenment or the rise of the corporate superpowers. People need to step back and take a look and try to understand what's going on in the world. Find out where your food is grown and how. Find out how money is created and how you're taxed. I know these things seem trivial, and the media inundates all of us with Canada's next top model and pro sports. We're unknowingly happy in our own servitude, willing to give up freedom for the better good of the corporate superpowers.
And so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger.